Thank you for having me. So first, my name is J.Robertson. I serve as the VP of Development with Próspera. And how I came to work with Próspera is because I studied public policy and spent many years working on policy reform at the state level in the United States. And I've always been motivated by how public policy impacts people. And good policy can help people, bad policy can hurt people. And about Próspera, it's just an immense opportunity to apply good policy at a much larger scale than is possible in other places. And so that's what brought me to Próspera. I've been with the company for about 4 years now. And my current role is I help new businesses and new residents that are using the Próspera zone. That's a good question, and there's a lot to unpack. So I'll do my best to start with your first question about special economic zones. So you're right that these are not a new idea, and it's been shown in places like Dubai or Hong Kong that setting up a special area that's designated to have a distinct legal framework that's distinct from the surrounding area can drive massive growth and development into that place. So that model's been proven again and again in multiple places. You look at Singapore, which is in many ways similar to a special economic zone, given its characteristics for the countries surrounding it. And in each of these places, you saw rapid growth and development that far exceeded what was possible outside of that jurisdiction. And the common element there is generally better rules that make it favorable for investors to invest, do business, create jobs, and drive development that benefits not only them, but the local population as well. And so especially economic zones are one concept. And then the charter city concept that you mentioned is a different idea, because a zone doesn't necessarily have to be limited to a city, although it can encompass a city or multiple cities. Similar in some ways in that its goal is to drive development and prosperity in places that are lacking that. And Próspera's approach is a little different than either of those, in that we look at the problem of a lack of opportunity for people across the developing world. If you look at the charts that show GDP per capita and map it against doing business index for how easy it is to do business in those places, the comparisons start much higher GDP per capita, which is one of the best ways to measure human well-being. And countries that have bad frameworks for doing business typically have lower prosperity GDP per capita. And if you distill that down to a really specific example, in a place like Honduras, the best and brightest of the country are leaving to go to the United States to seek opportunities that aren't available in their country. Well, when Hondurans leave Honduras and come to the United States, their per capita income increases by tenfold. And it's not that they became different people. It's not that moving between two imaginary lines changed their capacity to provide for themselves and their families. It's that they all of a sudden had access to an environment that allowed them to succeed, that gave them the ability to start a business or work at a business. And so when you look at that problem, the question is, how can we address it at the largest scale possible? So Próspera's approach is that the common element here is governance and rules for doing business, rules of the game. And Honduras has a unique approach to this that they've implemented called the ZA law. It's a Spanish acronym. It stands for Zones for Economic Development and Employment, roughly translated to English. And it's similar in many ways to the special economic zones that have been set up in other parts of the world, but it stands alone in its approach, which is that it allows for a public-private partnership, where a private company can partner with the government to receive a charter, get approval to actually set up, manage, and operate the zone. And so Próspera was one of the first companies to receive a charter that was granted under that law in Honduras. And we've created what we believe is one of the best frameworks for doing business in the world that borrows from some of these success cases and have deployed that in the Próspera ZA. which is formed under Honduran law as a similar to a municipality within Honduras. That's how the zone is structured. And then on top of that, we're working with developers, entrepreneurs, builders to build a city on top of that. And so, like you said, it's a bit of a hybrid approach. It borrows some of the best elements from each, but the goal is the same, which is to bring development and opportunities into a place where it's needed most. And we're still very early in terms of building out a special economic zone or a city. We've been at this for several years, but the results are already bearing fruit in many ways, that we have lots of people living and working and getting jobs here. And so, yeah, I'll pause there, but that's basically our approach to the issue and how we come at the question of how do you improve governance for people. Why Honduras? So the idea of creating a special economic zone to bring investment in the country is a fundamentally Honduran idea. There are many Honduran leaders who've discussed this. There's lack of access to good paying jobs. And so that's a top priority for every administration in Honduras. But dating back over a decade ago, there were some Honduran leaders who got the first time to say, why can't we build the same thing that's happening in Dubai or Singapore? Why can't we build this in Honduras? And so the key distinction that I mentioned earlier is that the Zete law in Honduras allows for a public-private partnership. And that's important for a couple of reasons. First of all, places like Dubai, the zone is still in many ways directly administered by the state government. And there are some drawbacks there. Directly managing the operations of the zone could in many ways potentially limit the upside or growth. And they also had the foresight to say that they did not want to limit the administration of a zone and the development of a zone to just whoever happened to be in Honduras willing to lead it from the central government's perspective. So opening up to private developers allow them to bring in brilliant legal minds who can study these systems and how they worked in other parts of the world and bring that to Honduras. Excuse me. And so that's another reason that this is such a unique model. And another key point is that many of these zones, there's lots of free zones, even in other parts of the Western Hemisphere, but none of the big scale projects we mentioned that have developed into these huge cities, the metropolis that has provided opportunities for tens of thousands of people. Most of those have been in the East. And so there hasn't been a project that has succeeded to the level of Dubai in the Western Hemisphere. And so why Honduras? Its proximity to the U.S., it's situated among sea trade routes, make it a really desirable place for American investment to come in and help create opportunities here. And another important point is that when many of these zones are set up by the central government, they are still susceptible to issues of regulatory capture from big businesses. And while zones can a lot of times eliminate that, what you see is a lot of these places have minimum investment requirements that make it good for big businesses and certain industries to come in, but might limit opportunities for smaller entrepreneurs or just startups. And Próspera's approach is one that makes it accessible to everyone. And so you don't have to have $50 million in annual revenue as a company to get the benefits of operating in Próspera. You can be a Honduran small business owner that wants to expand your operation. And you can be a Honduran citizen that's just looking for a better job. And so it's an open platform. And the success that we've seen has primarily been driven by Hondurans who have these new opportunities. Over 60% of our residents today are Hondurans, and the majority of the companies that have been created in the zone are run by Hondurans. And so I think a lot of times when you think about a project like this, people who are opposed to the idea can say, oh, well, it's just a bunch of rich people coming in and they're going to take advantage. But the reality is the complete opposite, in that we've seen the people who benefited most from the development so far have been who it was intended to benefit from the Honduran perspective, which are Honduran citizens. without going through a complete recitation of the political history, I'll start by just saying, how we got involved. As I mentioned, that this is a Honduran idea that was proposed by Honduran leaders, and the important piece here is that it's a public-private partnership. And so when we started looking for places that were good opportunities to bring this new model of governance, who wanted a model of governance like this, who needed the development opportunities, we came to Honduras specifically because they were seeking to bring about this kind of development. And we were the first company to receive an approval under the cidade law, one of 3 charters that was granted under that law, that was approved by the government of Honduras. And we've been operating publicly at least since 2020. That's when we completed the setup of the legal system, the deployment of the governance framework. That took multiple years, even after the charter was initially approved, to operationalize a new system of governance, taxation, regulation, commercial law, all that from scratch. And we definitely had the benefit of borrowing from best practices in other places, but it was several years of work to do that. And so, like I said, the important point here is that the only reason we're in Honduras is because we were invited, and Honduras was seeking to have a development like this. And we followed the formal process under the Honduran Constitution that allows for the creation of this zone. And after approval, have continued to operate in partnership with the Honduran government. So a couple of years ago, there was an election, a new change in leadership, and the current administration has initially had campaigned against the idea of ZEDEs, against the idea that developments like this had a place in Honduras. And this was contemplated by the Honduran leaders who set up the zone, because as you mentioned, the region is not known for legal stability. And that's one of the detriments that makes it hard for them to receive investment. And so that's why the ZEDE law was created, to give it the highest standard of legal protection possible, to ensure that the zones could continue operating if they were approved, if they were legitimate, if they followed the law in Honduras. And the place we're at now is that we are continuing to operate and abide by those laws as they've been stated. The current administration has made it more difficult in some ways, but they have not gone through with a repeal of the constitutional law in Honduras. And as one of 3 existing zones, Próspera enjoys acquired rights in Honduras and allows us to continue operating. And I think as time goes on, more and more Hondurans are supportive of the idea of ZEDEs. There's been lots of public polling that shows that this idea is really a niche issue in Honduras. It's not something that's top of mind for most people, but those who are aware of ZEDEs support them on a 4-to-1 basis. So 4-to-1 support for ZEDEs among people who know about them and are supportive of the mission. And we see that support only continuing to grow as we are continuing to operate in compliance with the law, both the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, which is that we continue growing and creating opportunities for Hondurans to succeed. The Próspera ZEDE, as created, is an instrumentality of the government, and currently there are over 1,000 acres that are part of the jurisdiction. About 400 or so acres are on the island of Roatan. Some more land is on mainland Honduras. The interesting thing about the ZEDE law is that it allows the ZEDE to maintain jurisdiction over properties that are non-contiguous. And so that gives builders the opportunity to develop in multiple places that might or might not be contiguous. So we started in Roatan because a lot of the natural advantages that Roatan has. And the property that's been incorporated so far is all voluntarily incorporated. So landowners choose to incorporate the property. There's a process to do that. Unlike what happens in some places where municipalities or cities can annex property without the consent of landowners. Everything is voluntary and consent based within Honduras. So no property within the ZA has ever been expropriated. No property within the ZA has ever been annexed without the consent of landowners. No residents of the ZA have ever been forced to join. Everything's voluntary. That's very important because it speaks to the spirit of the law, but then it also speaks to our philosophy, which is that there should be value for value exchange, and we're very opposed to any sort of coercion. So the property that we're focused on primarily is on Roatan, and developing that property out into the growing city, which is called St. John's Bay. That's the initial hub that's being built within the Próspera ZA in Roatan. We do have plans to develop the mainland property into an industrial facility that will be used for manufacturing and export, and potentially other hubs in the future. But our primary focus so far to this point in time has been on the hub in Roatan. And we do have plans to, continue to grow that as there are opportunities and as there are places to expand. But our primary focus is on the current property. And when it comes to building out the city, our approach is really to partner with entrepreneurs and private developers so that it's a community-driven approach as opposed to a top-down approach. We want to make sure that whatever is built actually meets the needs of the community as opposed to just the idea of a foreign investor. So first of all, the Honduran central government maintains control over immigration. So formal residency in Honduras or Honduran citizenship is still governed the way it is anywhere else in Honduras. If you are looking to do business within Próspera, there's a separate residency requirement that we have that's specific to the zone. And so after going through the Honduran immigration process as it exists, you can obtain a residency permit to live, work, or do business within the Próspera ZA. And that is available to citizens of most countries. And there's a physical residency option that allows you to spend up to the entire year within the zone. Once again, assuming that you've already met all the qualifications that Honduras has to be in the country. And there's also an e-residency option, which allows you to spend up to 30 days within the zone, and then also do business remotely if you have a business within the jurisdiction, but you're not located here full time. And so it's a dual path process, and the term residency can be confusing because it means different things within the immigration process. When we talk about Próspera residency or Próspera e-residency, that's a residency permit for the ZA that's separate and distinct from the Honduran process. That really functions like an access permit. Hondurans are able to access that for $260 a year. If you are not from Honduras, it's $1,300 a year to have the fiscal residency. It's available for $130 a year for people outside of Honduras. And to your question about who can access it, I mentioned earlier that the majority of our residents are Honduran. The majority of our businesses are Honduran, and we expect that to be the case as we continue to grow. We do have international investors. We have people from the U.S. who are setting up and operating businesses here, who are hiring Hondurans who are starting their own business. But that's the mix as it looks today, and we expect it'll be that way in the future because, once again, we're in Honduras. Whether they're within the United States government, the United States Department of State, that has really taken a role to try and address this issue, or if you talk to people in Honduras, there's a shared consensus that the driver of migration is lack of economic opportunity locally. That's the reason people are migrating to the United States primarily, is for jobs and to earn a living to support themselves and their families. And so, from our perspective, something like Próspera is not the only answer, but it's certainly an answer to how you address that. And I think it's borne out in what we've done so far and the jobs that we've created. Anecdotally, you see many of our residents who might have migrated to the United States. Many of our residents are Hondurans that actually went to the United States to be educated and came back home. And as opposed to going back to the United States to work, chose to stay here and work within Próspera. It's really inspiring to me because Hondurans are patriotic people. They love their country, and giving them that opportunity to do something they love while staying here and being close to their family is something that's really important. And Próspera is certainly a way to address that. And I think you see some of that come out in some of the statements that have been made by diplomats of the United States, urging Honduras to protect the investment guarantees that protect the Próspera. And it's certainly an answer. It's not the only one because it's a big problem, but absolutely that's the root cause, and this is one of the ways to address the problem. I would say it starts with our name, Próspera. Uh, you know, it means prosperity now, not prosperity in the future, not prosperity in the past, but prosperity now. And that's what drives us, is creating opportunities for prosperity for everyone, not just an elite few, not just big business, but everyone. And so I would say that's the ethos that undergirds everything that we do. And then when you drill deeper to how do we implement that through policy, it's really through looking at what works in other parts of the world. I mentioned earlier that all countries are scored on a doing business index that allows you to see what countries are doing well, what countries are not doing well. And there are some common themes in the countries that are doing well. And so it's a pretty consensus opinion among people that study the economics of public policy that there are a handful of things that are really important to create an environment where prosperity can thrive through growth and business development. And it starts with respect for property rights and individual rights. So Próspera has a very strong Bill of Rights, and that extends to property rights, respect for private ownership of property. And then when you expand that out to how it applies to business, it's a system of taxation that is fair, that's flat, that's easy to comply with, and a regulatory system that allows innovators to innovate and appropriately balances questions of risk and public safety to ensure that third parties aren't harmed, but that innovators are allowed to build their businesses in a way that maximizes their chances of success. And it also includes access to justice, a clear and reliable system for people to resolve disputes when they arise. And we've chosen to use arbitration as the primary default dispute resolution system within Próspera. There's an affiliated arbitration center that's available, the Próspera Arbitration Center, that's staffed by judges but residents can use any arbitration center of their choice when doing business within the zone to resolve disputes through contract. And there's more I could go into, but without going too deep into legal code, I would say those are really the bedrocks of it. And once again, what the entire linchpin here is that all of this is voluntary. So everyone who chooses to operate in Próspera does so voluntarily. They sign a contract with the government service provider that says, yes, I understand the rules. Yes, I know what this is. And that's a binding contract between the jurisdiction and the resident. And the members of the Próspera Council that govern the jurisdiction are actually fiduciaries to the residents. So they're responsible in making decisions in the best interests of the residents. And that's really a radical notion. You think about how most governments operate. Most governments are not fiduciaries. Most regulators and policymakers don't bear that high level of responsibility to the people that they serve. They may talk about it, but when the rubber meets the road, if they don't live up to that expectation, residents and citizens don't have any recourse. In Próspera and in the Próspera, they do. And that's really important to us, that everything's voluntary. And so far, I would say it's bearing fruit. But yeah, that's how I would describe the principles that undergird the development. So in New York City, for instance, there are vertical property rights for buildings that are built vertically. The approach that we've taken is to tie those to property, but then also make them tradable and fungible so that people can own property rights. They choose not to use those, they can be traded to something else. But in a discrete example, yes, it could address that issue, saying, in most places, disputes about a building blocking a view or people not wanting development in certain places, those questions are generally decided by a zoning or planning commission. And those are also the culprit that drives up housing costs in many places, because it just dramatically slows development. It drives up costs for developers that nobody's satisfied with the outcome. And so from our perspective, property rights are a better solution to that problem by giving private ownership of not just the parcel of land, but the air rights above it. And it also allows us to manage the development in a responsible way, so that, as opposed to going through a zoning board that might not have the right incentive structure to make decisions about what goes where, Próspera Incorporated can, as a landowner, help make decisions about what goes where in a way that's market driven. And the vertical 3D property rights are a mechanism we can use to do that. I will say we're very early, we're still building, but that's our approach. That is the idea, to make it so that these issues don't have to be litigated in a political fashion where 49% of people are angry with the outcome, which is the case in politics everywhere, even at a very local level, or maybe especially at a local level when you're dealing with something that's getting built next to somebody's home. And property rights can be a better way to address that issue, and that's our approach to it. So within Próspera, there are regulatory requirements if you're looking to provide medical services or work in the medical field. And our regulatory system is similar in many ways to a reciprocal approach, in that if you are a doctor that is licensed as a doctor in the United States, for example, you can apply to work as a doctor with that Próspera cidade, and you're able to come and practice. That's not the case in most countries throughout the world, even in Honduras outside of Próspera. And what that leads to is doctors not being willing to our approach is one of reciprocity, and there are over 30 OECD countries that are recognized for that. And there are checks and balances. So the Próspera cidade is a regulator who reviews those applications, ensures that everything is. It's not the Wild West where anyone can come and say, I'm a doctor, and start treating people. There's definitely a regulatory process in place to ensure that there's a quality of care and a standard of care within the cidade. But there's no reason, in my mind personally, there's no reason that a doctor who, say for instance, wants to come here and provide treatment, even charitably, at no fee to locals, there are barriers in place that make it difficult for them to do that many times in places like Honduras. And the system eliminates that says if you're approved by somewhere like the United States, you should be allowed to come and do business here. But there's definitely a regulatory process in place to do that. That applies to other industries as well. But medicine is certainly a big one. And yeah, that's our approach to the regulatory question for that industry. First of all, I would say that it's a community-driven approach, and that we don't mandate that you have to have a certain type of school if you're looking to operate within Próspera, because we believe there are lots of different models of success that can work differently for every kid, because each child is different, and some can thrive well in a certain environment and not in another one. And so our goal is to have a multitude of options, especially when it comes to innovation. So we are not replicating a factory model of public schooling that's shown to have many shortcomings in many parts of the country. To date, we have some online schools that are operating. Our largest in-person school is a Montessori school called Guidepost Montessori at Roatan. It's operated by Two Higher Ground, which is the largest Montessori school operator in the world. They have campuses all over the world, and they partner with Próspera to bring their first Latin American location in Honduras. So that's operating here today. They've had remarkable success. They're doing great things. And our goal is to partner with more people like that. But once again, it's always in response to, so it might be Montessori, it might be virtual, it might be another innovative approach that we're not even aware of. There's demand for your service, then Prosper is a place for you to come and offer that as an educational option. So it's one of choice that's driven by community demand. And that's really our philosophy when it comes to most industries within Prosper, but especially education, because it is so versatile and the approaches can be different for each family. And we hope that as we continue to grow, we'll have more operators like that providing different options within the zone. So, like I mentioned, the Próspera Zete is a political subdivision of Honduras. And so it's similar to a municipality in many ways. There is a technical secretary that acts similar to the mayor. In some respects, he's a Honduran named Jorge Calendres, who has really been a leader in Honduran circles that were looking to promote this kind of development. And he's a brilliant legal mind. He's the current technical secretary. There's also a council made up of 9 members that acts almost like a city council, but they're the primary legislative body for the jurisdiction. The members of that council, as comprised now, when we set up the jurisdiction as the promoter and organizer of the zone, Honduras Próspera Incorporated appointed the majority of those members of that council. Once the zone reaches a population of 10,000 full-time residents, the majority of those council members will be directly elected by the residents of the zone. They're fiduciaries of the residents of the jurisdiction, so they're bound to act in their best interests. And their authority is also limited by the powers that are granted to them under the charter of the Próspera Zete. So when the jurisdiction is set up, that charter is approved by the Honduran government, which means that everything that they do as an official of the zone, they're acting as a council member for the zone, which is a political subdivision of Honduras, and are acting under the mandates of the charter as approved by Honduras. And so in many ways, it's similar to your traditional city. The difference is that they're not acting according to your traditional federal, state, municipal laws, but the laws of the country of Honduras, the Constitution of Honduras, and the Zete law, and the Próspera Zete charter, all of which are approved by Honduras. Accountability is everything, and the fact that they're fiduciaries is the strongest mechanism to ensure they're accountable. Transparency is also very important, which is why every action that's made by the council is posted and publicly available online on their website, so that anybody can access it, including residents, to see exactly what actions they're taking. This is something that was contemplated by the forefathers of this idea in Honduras, the people that worked on this for years to bring a development to Honduras. So the first component of that is the Zete law has the highest standard of legal protection possible in Honduras. So the Constitution was amended by the majority of Congress to put this in the Honduran Constitution, and that remains today. Honduras has a strong legal doctrine of acquired rights, which means that even if at some point in the future the Constitution were to be amended to repeal that provision, that existing zones would be able to continue operating for a minimum period of at least 50 years, transition period, and to give legal protection within the country. And then as international investors that come in to promote and organize the zone, there are also protections in place via international treaty that further safeguard that. So the biggest one is a treaty between the United States and Honduras called CAFTA-DR. It's the Central American Free Trade Agreement, to which the Dominican Republic, Honduras, and other Latin American countries are working with the United States to ensure that investment within the country cannot be seized in violation of the law without compensation being given to those investors. So that acts as a disincentive for a future administration to ignore the law and choose to expropriate the property. And, you know, from our perspective, that's one of the highest standards of legal protection that's possible anywhere in the world. At the end of the day, that doesn't prevent a politician from just saying they're going to ignore the law and try to expropriate property, steal private property from individuals. And that's where that protection comes into place. There's a strong financial disincentive for them to do that because the government will be liable for any damages caused by that expropriation. But then on the positive side, I think what's more important is that there's a huge positive incentive for Honduras to allow this growth to happen because the country is so starved for investment and opportunity. And now that we're a few years in, we can see that the zone is starting to deliver on that promise, in spite of some political headwinds. And there's millions of dollars that have been invested, hundreds of companies have been created, thousands of jobs have been created locally. For not just businesses that are prospering, but even other businesses in Honduras that are now allowed to grow because of the new opportunities that are coming. And so I think that's even more important is that as the zones are allowed to continue to grow and operate, that those opportunities are created, and that's a huge positive incentive. So there's actually a financial incentive on the upside for the government of Honduras without having to actually serve the people. So Honduras receives a portion of the tax revenue generated from within Próspera without having to provide those services. Those are provided by a private enterprise, and so that's a big positive incentive. And those things work together ideally to support the stability of the jurisdiction in the future. We're in a proving period right now, and that we're still early. When you look in the United States at Disney, which was built in a special economic zone in Florida and came into a conflict with the Florida government, they sought to undo something. People realize that even in places that are quote unquote stable or thought to be stable, like the United States, there are always these conflicts of federalism where central governments try to take away rights or privileges that are granted to other subdivisions of the government. And the best that we can do is guard against those and ensure that there are strong negative disincentives to ensure that doesn't happen, but then also really positive incentives to encourage the central government to allow for the system to grow and thrive to meet the mission that's really shared by everybody, which is, once again, prosperity. Growth is the key word. I think we've seen remarkable growth in the activity within the zone here in Roatan over the last year. Businesses, jobs being created. I think we'll continue seeing that, assuming that the current political environment allows that to continue to thrive. And so I think we'll see that here in Roatan. And that's our primary focus, is to support the growth and development of this as the first hub that's using the Próspera platform. Since we have launched, we've received lots of requests and inquiries from people in other parts of the world or people in other countries in Latin America even, who are saying, we want to bring Próspera here. We want something like Próspera in our country. And the interesting thing about what we built is that now that we have this governance system in place, it's tailored to Honduras and for the ZE law in Honduras, but it can be replicated in other places. And so we're always interested in having those conversations. Our CEO and founder, Eric Bremen, met with President Bukele in El Salvador, which is near Honduras, and that was publicized online. And we are seeing a growing interest in the idea of a special economic zone, and would love to partner with people like that. We also recently announced that we now have a Próspera Africa division that's being staffed by Magat Wade, who is who is from Africa originally and is working to bring the model there. So, we're optimistic that we'll see much more of this, because in reality, if we want to address this problem of global poverty, we need innovation and governance everywhere. And so one Próspera hub in one place, it's not enough to bring billions of people out of poverty and give them opportunities. We need thousands of Próspera-like developments all around the world that are giving people opportunities. And we're definitely interested in doing our part to bring that to fruition. Although our primary focus is building right here, right now, I've been really impressed to see all the progress that's happening in the space around the world.